Welcome to the podcast for a Jesus Youth. We are a family of teenagers joining a movement of God through Portland and spreading to the ends of the earth. We believe that the Spirit of God is breaking out and working through us to bring the love of Jesus to a world in darkness. And we are all welcome on this journey. So enjoy the teaching. Peace.
So tonight we are talking about the fear of God and the fear of man as it pertains to our identity. And more specifically, kind of like the core thesis that we're working out of tonight is this, is that placing the fear of man on the throne of our lives will lead to anxiety and insecurity, but having the fear of God on the throne will lead to a life of peace and flourishing. Now, this concept of the fear of God and the fear of man are things that if you have been raised in the church, you have probably heard about thousands and thousands of times. And you have probably been talked to about what that actually means, maybe twice. I remember growing up in the church and hearing this concept talked about all the time. This is kind of bothering me that I'm not centered. There we go. All the OCD people, sigh of relief. Anyways, I remember hearing this concept nonstop and constantly wondering what this was all about. Like, do I need to be terrified of God and not be afraid of people? Like, what does this actually mean? So tonight we're going to do a little bit of exegesis or walking through a passage in Proverbs 29:25. So if you have a Bible, turn there smack dab in the middle of the good book, as they say. Someone says that, I'm sure, somewhere. And this is a beautiful, short and sweet passage, as many Proverbs are, but there's a lot of richness that I think we'll be able to unpack and more clearly walk away understanding what this concept of the fear of God and the fear of man is. So, Proverbs 29:25 says this: "The fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe." Now, I don't know about you, but this is one of those verses where if I read in the morning before I had coffee and was still waking up and be like, the fear of the Lord, fear of man is a snare, and okay, got it. Like, trust in God, that's great. And I read over that word snare, and you kind of interpret it like, oh, there's gonna be like a branch in your path as you're running and you don't wanna trip over it, otherwise you'll get a scrape on your knee and need a Band-Aid for your boo-boo, and then like we'll all be good. But we don't want boo-boos because those are bad. But there's a little more to it than that, and I think we'd be missing out on the intent that the authors had, because there's a lot of gravity here beyond just like, oh, we could trip and fall. No, there's a lot more to it. So the Hebrew definition of this word snare is this word mokesh. Can you guys say mokesh? One more time, mokesh. Beautiful. So this is to be ensnared. It's a trap or a noose. So it's used in kind of the terms of a hunter pursuing an animal, laying a trap to catch his or her prey, right? And a lot of times this, like, you don't catch an animal just to keep it as a pet typically, especially in those days. No, you catch it for food or for fur or for some sort of need that you are trying to fulfill. Whatever you are ensnaring would lead to death. Like, I hate to tell you, but that's what happens. And the author uses this word on purpose because he's not just saying that we're gonna trip and fall. No, this snare, right? This snare of having the fear of man can lead to death. There's gravity here. There's importance here. Now, this word mokesh, I did a little research of my own. I was very proud of myself. But used in Israel today by Israeli forces in the army, they actually call landmines mokesh, right? So this term snare has evolved and turned into an even more like urgent, if you step on this snare, you will die. Like, this is not good. This is something to be avoided. So right here, we need to like perk up and listen a little more. Now, Webster's dictionary adds a little more layers onto this. It has one element that is really interesting. It says, the snare is something by which one is entangled, involved in difficulties, or impeded. or it is something deceptively attractive, interesting. This adds a whole new layer to this idea because if you think about it, for anything with half a brain, right, it could be an animal, it could be a human, to be caught in a snare, there has to be something tricking it into thinking that it is not walking into something dangerous or even potentially life-threatening, right? So something deceptively attractive. It's interesting, right? And we all know as followers of Jesus, this is often how the enemy chooses to maneuver, right? And try and convince us that something is actually for our good, when in reality, it is actually here to hurt us and to harm us. So what is this idea of, what is happening here that is causing us to be so caught unaware when it comes to the fear of man? Well, this is where the correlation between fear and approval come into play. And if you think about the words fear and approval, they're two very different ideas. Like if you write them down on a piece of paper and list out the attributes, fear, right? Being nervous, afraid, terrified, something that causes you anxiety or worry. Approval, getting an A on your test, getting a thumbs up from your teacher or coach, right? Two very polar opposite ideas here. But when we're talking about the fear of man, fear and approval have everything to do with one another. One author puts it like this, which is an incredibly helpful way to think of it. He says, the person or persons to whom we ascribe most authority to define who we are, what we're worth, what we should do, and how we should do it is the person that we fear the most, because it is the person whose approval we want the most. Think about that. Think about any person, group of people, parents, family, teachers in your life that you are desperate for the approval of, right? It is those people that the author here is implying that we actually fear those people the most. Think about this. You're about to ask someone who you have had a crush on for a long time on a date, right? And you don't know what they're gonna say. Right, let's rewind 10 years where we're not asking a question that we already know the answer to, right? You don't know what's gonna happen. Everything is on the line, right? You are putting yourself out there and you are deeply anxious about what the outcome of your desire is gonna be for this person, right? You need the approval. And depending on what the outcome is, whether they say yes or no, your day is gonna be made, or your next couple weeks are gonna be really rough and filled with a lot of Ben and Jerry's and Netflix binging, right? So this shapes our very lives. The people who we go to for approval and for affirmation, the people who we are desiring approval from, shape our very identity. They dictate our moods, right? What we listen to, what we wear, who we hang out with, what we say. Everything about us is dictated by who the most important person is in our life, who we are going to for approval. And this is a very human thing. This is a very common attribute among all of us. In fact, I think we were created to need the approval of someone, and that someone is God, but we are constantly trying to look side to side to our peers, to our mentors, to other people in our life to look for approval there, yet we inevitably find pain and disappointment because, spoiler alert, none of us are God and none of us offer the same level of peace and flourishing that he does. I remember early on in my high school career, I was a freshman at this point, and I wasn't really walking with Jesus. I knew about him, but I didn't know him. A bunch of you know parts of my story. And at that point in my life, the only things that were important to me were that I was good at basketball and that I had a lot of people that liked me. And if people didn't, I had a serious problem. There was this guy on my team named Jay, and Jay was the star of our basketball team. He was super popular. He basically checked every box for how to make it in high school. I'm sure you can all guess what those things are. He had it all in high school, which is really not having a lot, but when you're that young, it looks like a lot. Sorry to spoil it for you guys. But all that I wanted, right, and I was fine, but all that I wanted was I saw Jay, and I was like, I want to be like that guy. I want that. And on paper, like if I was being honest, I would have said that I didn't really like him that much. Like we didn't even really like get along. We didn't have similar interests. And I didn't want his approval because I wanted to be friends with him. I wanted his approval because I wanted what he had, right? I wanted to use him to gain the same clout, the same group of friends, the same level of popularity that he had, right? It wasn't rooted in respect or love or admiration or whatever. It was rooted in, man, how can Jake be further along in the totem pole? And it was this futile effort of me continually changing who I was, right? I was listening to things I didn't even like. I was wearing things I didn't want to wear. I was talking to people in ways that wasn't really me. And I turned into this social chameleon that had no idea who I was because I was desperate for the approval of people around me, people that weren't even really like me, right? And we weren't really friends, but I was like, I can fit that mold. I can be that person. I can be who you want to be so that I get your approval. Fast forward a couple years later, and I have like a newfound relationship with Jesus. And this whole Jay conversation kind of is out the window, and I haven't really thought about it in a while. And then my senior year, things kind of go downhill for him a little bit, and he starts like getting engaged with the police, all sorts of these kinds of things. And like this icon of Jay in my mind is just like down the drain. And I remember one moment specifically where, again, this I hadn't thought about it in like over a few years, but I looked back on it and I thought, how much time did I waste? How much wasted effort, thought went into being someone who I thought like the world wanted me to be, right? I was so desperate for approval that I wasted weeks, months of my life, right, pursuing things that I thought others would want me to pursue in order to accept me and to have a place and to be like approved of, right? That is what fear of man is when we talk about that. And the worst thing about it is like I'm saying, it drains us of life. It is a snare. It is a trap. It is a noose. Think of something that literally chokes life from you. When you are so busy pursuing the fear of man, you are missing out on real life to the full that we can experience when we are fully who we were created to be in Christ. And he has so much in store. I think about even growing up in church, and I love music and I love to worship. And it is one of the main ways that I engage with the Spirit, and I love it. And I think about all the times that I stood in church and was too afraid to raise my hands and engage with the Holy Spirit because there was people next to me, and I was like, what if they think I'm weird because I'm raising my hands? Like, how silly is that? It's ridiculous. Like, I'm missing out on communing with the creator of the universe because I'm too preoccupied with what raising my hands is gonna look like. It's crazy. So we have kind of a little clearer understanding what the fear of man looks like. So the word tells us that we need to leave behind a fear of man, and the fear of God needs to be on the throne of our life. So what does this mean? Because this is something that I misunderstood for a long time until honestly, like embarrassingly recent. So if you're in that boat tonight, you are in good company, I promise you. So Martin Luther, amazing theologian, amazing man of God, breaks fear down into two categories, which are actually really helpful, and we are gonna talk about tonight to have a little clearer understanding. So the first of these two categories is servile fear. Everybody say servile. Yeah, it sounds kind of like gerbil. It's not, it's servile. Think of the word like servant or servitude, right? So this is in reference to the fear that a prisoner would have to his jailer or executioner, or that a slave would have to a cruel master, right? It's rooted in anxiety and worry and terror. Like, think of the fear that you have when you wake up from a nightmare and there's just like chaos in your mind and you can't think straight and you're terrified. Like, so that is the first kind of fear. And honestly, it's basically the only kind of fear that we really think about in our culture today, which is why this idea of the fear of God is so difficult to grasp, because we miss out on this second idea, which is filial fear. Everyone say filial. Filial, one more time. Love it. So this is where we get the term familial, right? This is the kind of fear that a child would have for its father, right? This fear is rooted in love and respect and honor and awe, right? This is the fear that someone has for someone that they love so much that the last thing that they want to do is to disappoint them, right? It's not caught up in doing works. It's not caught up in, okay, what can I do for you? All it is that I have so much respect and love for you that I don't want to disappoint you. The house that I grew up in, my dad worked from home, and he had this really nice home office. And I remember, man, he's like super consistent. So every time he would come talk to me, it was always the same. It was like, hey, bud, do you have like 5 minutes just to talk in my office? And every time I was like, no, I didn't want to go, because every time that's where we would go to talk when I was in trouble or did something wrong or needed correction. And I hated it. I'm sure you all have like that place that your family like talks to you about how you've been like on your phone too much or whatever. I hated it. And I grew up, and I didn't have any reason to like be afraid of my dad. I had a really great relationship with my father, and he's an amazing guy. But every time he did it, I was terrified. And looking back on it now as an adult, I'm realizing that it was rooted in this idea of filial fear, right? That I loved him and respected him so much that the very thought of him being disappointed in me was like the worst thing in the world, right? And that's kind of where we land on this idea of filial fear. And it's the biblical fear that we talk about that we are supposed to have for God, right? It's rooted in not wanting to ever make a mistake or not wanting to like ever do anything wrong, but it's rooted in like love and respect and admiration, right? That leads us to alter our lives to try and be better apprentices of Jesus, better men and women of God, right? So this is the healthy fear that we are called to have for the Lord. It's rooted in adoration, respect, right? And if we do this, man, all things of following Jesus follow after that, right? Proverbs 9 says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and understanding. He's saying that the very baseline of who we are as disciples of Jesus is rooted in, man, looking to him as our sole source of acceptance, right? Our sole source of love, right? Fearing him, acknowledging him, like worshiping him, loving him, respecting him. And if this analogy even of like a father is kind of lost on you, and if your dad is out of the picture or have an unhealthy relationship with him, the beauty of following God is that he wants to restructure that idea of who our Father is, because he is a good and perfect Father, that the word says he will never leave or forsake us. A lot of times I think of God the Father as the dad who wants to hang our like D- report card on the fridge, even though it's like pathetic and sad, or like our horrible crayon drawing of like, this is like me and my family, and like your dad is 7 feet tall and you look like a dog, and like what's even going on there? But he hangs it on the fridge anyway, right? Because he's a good Father, right? Who doesn't need us to perform and be perfect to accept us. No, he has approved of us before we were even born. All he asks is that we say yes to him and follow him. So again, fear of the Lord does not mean to be afraid of God or to fear him, but to simply have a deep respect and admiration for the Father as the one who provides, who protects for us, who sometimes disciplines us, but it's rooted in love, right? He doesn't want us to fear him because he's some egotistical maniac. He doesn't want us to be afraid and tremble. No, in fact, actually, he wants to keep us out of that snare. He wants to keep us off of the landmine, saying, man, I don't want you to waste your life chasing the approval of people, because every single person in this room is doing the same thing. We are all looking for approval from somewhere. Now, this is something that is still kind of like hard to wrap our brains around, which I totally get, because culture doesn't do us any favors when it comes to this idea of fear. But the word commands us to do not be afraid, and that use of afraid is back to that servile fear, right? That terror, that anxiety, that unhealthy fear. It commands us to do not be afraid 365 times. That's one time a year for those of you keeping track. So if you want to do like a weird journaling thing, like just find that reference every single day this year. I'll give you like $1 if you do that or something. Now, this shows us that, like, man, the Bible doesn't contradict itself. So if it tells us to fear God, but it says that we're not to be afraid of him, and that means that he's not a God to be afraid of. And it sounds like, I know that's a lot of like different words, but it's simply saying, like, he is not an angry God. He's not a God who is gonna like take what we give him and turn on us, right? And all of a sudden, like, we don't know the God that we're serving. No, all he's saying is, look to me for approval because I am the only one who will give it and give you peace and life. And our generation, again, and our culture says that all approval that we get needs to be earned. But somehow, like, the countercultural nature of the God that we serve flips that clear on its head and he goes, actually, you never have to earn a single thing. The beautiful thing is that we have been given approval by God, right? This is insane. And it's so hard to really wrap our minds around the gravity of this because, again, every single person in our life, every single thing that we see on TV or on our Insta feed is saying that our approval needs to be earned by the people around us, by the things that we do, by what we wear, you name it. Yet somehow, God sent his son to die for us and then said, yes, I approve of you now. Picture you are preparing for your SATs, right? The biggest test of your life so far. And the world is telling you that this is like the most anxious moment of your life. And you sit down to take the test, and the teacher tells you to put down your pencil before you've started and comes to you and hands you $1 million and says that you got a perfect score. What? That doesn't make any sense. And that is not exactly, man, what God did for us, you guys, is infinitely more impactful forever than that very thing, right? He says, you never had to earn anything. And in fact, I'm gonna give you the reward like you did do something, but actually, I'm the one who sacrificed everything for you. I gave you my son. He died the death that we should have, right? Jesus fell onto the landmine that we should have been on and the very snare that is waiting for us. And yet he says, no, I approve of you. You have a place in my kingdom forever, right? Romans 3:22 says that we are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. I'm gonna read that again. We are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. You guys, we never stop in our apprenticeship to Jesus, which means that we are always trying to be better followers, trying to be more like Christ. But we operate from this place of peace, knowing that he is our source of approval, right? We don't operate out of this place of striving to gain peace by getting approval from other people. No, we already get to use this reserve of peace and flourishing from the fact that we are approved by God, right? That he has chosen us, that he has called us worthy of his love. We get to operate from that place in full faith, knowing that he is good and knowing that he is for us. So tonight, this is a concept, again, that is sometimes simple to talk about, but really hard and takes a lot of courage to walk out. Because like I said earlier, you are not alone in this. This is such an incredibly human thing to struggle with. I struggle with it still to this day. Your leaders struggle with it. All of us on staff, like every single person on this planet. And you may be sitting here and feeling like you are a literal prisoner to the approval of other people. You might even be sitting here and feeling like, nah, this isn't really a big deal to me. I don't really see it. And I don't say this to be a fear monger or anything, but if you're sitting here and you fall in that camp, I promise you that every single person in this room there is something that we are looking for approval. It could be a person, it could be a family member, it could be a potential relationship, it could be a current relationship, right? Oftentimes, I feel like I look to my wife, Molly, for approval more than I look to God for approval, and that just isn't right? Even though the world says no, that's probably fine, I need to be elevating my fear of God far more than my fear of Molly. You're not that scary though, it's okay. And our culture and generation waves under this weird false banner that's so phony, that says that we don't need anyone, we don't serve anyone, you do you, Bo, you do you, Bo, you do you, boo, chase your bliss, whatever. And I'm that's crap. That's such a lie. And we trick ourselves into believing that we are not constantly seeking the approval of other people. And man, we are deceiving ourselves. I do it all the time. I feel like I'm past that. And then all of a sudden I find myself super caught up in what I'm wearing because of what other people are wearing around me. And something so silly that I'm I feel like I dealt with this in high school, and here it is again at the ripe age of 25. So we need to be aware that this is something that is always going to be part of our life because it's how we're wired. It's how God created us. We are dependent upon him. And so let's not mistake that and fill in the place where the fear of God goes with the fear of man, because it will fail, you guys. So again, placing the fear of man on the throne of our life is always going to lead to fear and anxiety and worry. But placing God, the fear of God on the throne of our life, is going to lead to peace and flourishing. You guys, this is beautifully countercultural and something that we are just desperate to take a hold of.